Title: The Curse of Hollow's End. Chapter 1: The Inheritance. The old house at Hollow's End had always been a shadow in Lena Carter's life, a distant whisper of a place she knew more from ghost stories than from memory. Her mother had never spoken of it. No family pictures adorned the walls. No trinkets from that part of her past graced their home. The only mention had been in quiet, reluctant tones. A place forgotten and cursed. An inheritance left untouched. But all that changed with the letter. Lena had returned to her childhood home in the sprawling grey city of Echo Ridge. When the news came, Sarah O'Bannon, her estranged aunt, had passed away. A woman Lena barely knew. A name shrouded in mystery and secrecy. She remembered only vague recollections. A strange woman in old photographs. A voice filled with dread whenever her mother spoke of her. It wasn't until Lena turned 23, the same age Sarah had been when she inherited Hollow's End, that the letter arrived, marked with the unmistakable seal of O'Bannon. The inheritance had passed to her. There were no explanations, no condolences, just the final words of Sarah's will. To my dear niece, Lena, the house at Hollow's End is yours now. I trust you will know what to do with it. The curse is in our blood, but it is yours to bear now. Lena had no choice. The decision to visit Hollow's End was a reluctant one. She had heard the local rumours of strange happenings in the old house, whispers about lights flickering in the windows long after nightfall, about figures seen in the distance, their faces blurred and their gazes hollow. But more than that, there was something about the place that called to her, a strange pull deep within her core. Perhaps it was the bloodline, the legacy of a family that had stood for centuries, its name long linked to the eerie history of Hollow's End. Her car had barely passed the rusted sign at the foot of the long, winding road when she noticed the silence, a kind of silence that felt alive, like the earth itself was holding its breath, watching. The house loomed in the distance, hidden in a fog that seemed to rise from the very ground. The trees around it twisted unnaturally, their gnarled limbs reaching out like skeletal fingers. Even the sky was heavy with something unspoken, the clouds hanging low as though they too were reluctant to witness what was to come. Lena shivered, her skin crawling, but she pressed on. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, louder than it should have been in the deep quiet. And as the house came into view, the first thing Lena noticed was its oppressive stillness. No birds, no animals, not even the rustle of leaves stirred the air. Just the house, waiting. Hollow's End was ancient, an immense Victorian structure, its dark windows staring like eyes into the void. The stone facade was cracked, the once bright paint chipped and peeling, as though the house had forgotten the meaning of time. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, though Lena knew that wasn't true. Sarah had lived here until her death just weeks ago. She pulled up to the front steps and sat there for a moment, the engine idling, the sound the only thing breaking the silence. The house was foreboding, like a tomb, and as the weight of the inheritance pressed upon her shoulders, she wondered whether Sarah had truly left her anything of value, or just a curse. With a deep breath, Lena stepped out of the car. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the ground beneath her feet felt too soft, as though the earth itself was giving way to something dark beneath. She walked to the front door, her heart hammering in her chest. There was a faint smell of decay in the air, the scent of mildew and rot that clung to the wooden steps. The door was unlocked. She entered the house slowly, the door creaking on its hinges. The moment she stepped inside, an overwhelming chill wrapped around her, as though she had crossed an invisible threshold into another world. The air was thick with dust and stale air, the smell of age and neglect. Faint light filtered in from the tall, grimy windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. The house seemed to breathe, its walls groaning under the weight of time. There was something uncanny about the silence inside, a hush that went beyond mere stillness. It was as if the house itself was watching, waiting. The walls seemed to close in around her as she moved deeper into the hallway. Lena's footsteps echoed in the emptiness. The floors creaked, groaned underfoot, as if the house were alive and resentful of her intrusion. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. The house was not merely a relic of the past, it was alive with something darker. She could feel it pressing against her, a force, an energy that seemed to pulse from the very heart of the house. At the end of the hallway, a door stood ajar. It was the only room that looked as if it hadn't been touched in years. Every other room in the house was decayed. Dust had settled on everything, and broken furniture lay scattered in disarray. But this room, the door seemed almost too well kept, too pristine. The curiosity inside her swelled, and Lena couldn't help but approach it. The door opened with a reluctant creak, revealing a darkened room that smelled of age-old wood and something else, something bitter, metallic. The faint glow from the hallway cast shadows over everything, but it didn't seem to reach the back of the room. There, against the far wall, stood an old, tarnished mirror. The glass cracked in several places. The surface seemed alive, reflecting something that wasn't quite real. Lena stepped forward, drawn inexplicably to the mirror. The closer she got, the colder the air became, and the shadows seemed to thicken around her. The reflection in the mirror was distorted, as if the very glass was warping to conceal something. A voice, a whisper, echoed faintly in her mind. "Don't look. Don't look into the glass." Lena recoiled, the voice coming not from anyone in the room but from deep within herself. The words were a warning, a command to step away, but the pull toward the mirror was too strong. She found herself stepping forward, one slow, trembling step after another. Her reflection seemed to shimmer, and for a brief moment she could have sworn that someone was standing behind her. Her breath caught in her throat, and the air grew unbearably cold. But Lena was beyond reason now. She reached out and touched the glass. The moment her fingers made contact with the surface, the world around her seemed to shudder. The mirror rippled like water, and the reflection of the room in front of her distorted, twisting, bending, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn apart. Her hand recoiled from the mirror as the world seemed to crash down around her. The room grew darker, colder, and the air thickened with the scent of rot. And then, as quickly as it started, everything returned to normal. Lena stood there, heart pounding, staring at the mirror. The coldness was gone. The air was still, but the silence was deeper, heavier now. She felt the weight of the house's presence pressing against her from all sides, like a predator stalking its prey. "What the hell is happening here?" she whispered to herself. But the house offered no answers, only silence. And with that, the first chapter of Lena's stay in Hollow's End began. Chapter 1 continued. The Echo of Secrets. Lena stood frozen, her fingers still tingling from the brief contact with the cold, distorted surface of the mirror. The quiet of Hollow's End weighed down on her like an invisible force. She could almost hear the thrum of something, a low hum beneath the stillness. But when she strained her ears, it vanished, replaced by the heavy silence that always seemed to follow her wherever she went. The room felt larger now, as if it had stretched out in the moments since she touched the mirror. Her eyes flickered toward the door, but her body refused to move. There was something sinister about the reflection. It didn't match what was before her. The corners of the room, its shadows, seemed to twist unnaturally, as if they were more than just light and dark, as if they were waiting. Lena shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. She had to remain calm. "This is just the house," she told herself. The house was old. It had a history. Things like old mirrors and dark corners were to be expected. There was no such thing as ghosts or curses. At least, that's what she had convinced herself of, after years of ignoring her mother's hushed warnings. But as she turned her gaze back to the reflection, she saw something shift. Her own image blinked, but not at the same time as her. Her heart lurched. Lena spun on her heel, breath coming in shallow gasps. The room behind her was still empty. The door was still ajar. No one had come in. And yet, the image in the mirror had changed. Her reflection had shifted, its stance no longer mimicking her. It stood there, still as a statue, facing her but with a sinister tilt to its head, as if it were observing her, not the other way around. Lena took an involuntary step back. Her foot caught on a loose floorboard and she stumbled, narrowly catching herself on the doorframe. Her pulse was thundering in her ears. She blinked rapidly, trying to shake off the mounting terror. It's just a trick of the light. It has to be. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. She had seen it. her reflection, not moving the way she moved, and the expression in its eyes. It wasn't hers. A cold draft swept through the room, carrying with it the faintest scent of something foul, decay, mildew, something worse. Lena's breath hitched as she caught sight of something new. At the very edge of the mirror, barely perceptible in the dull light, a figure stood just out of reach. It was only a shadow at first, but as she focused, it became clearer. A thin, gaunt face with hollow eyes staring at her through the glass. Her blood ran cold. The figure's gaze pierced her, its stare chilling her to the bone, and for a brief, terrifying second, Lena could have sworn it was smiling. She reached for the door, her hand shaking violently. The air around her felt thick, heavy, as if the house itself was closing in. Her heart raced, every muscle screaming for her to run, to leave this room and never come back. She glanced back at the mirror one last time, but the figure was gone. Her reflection was back to normal, perfectly still, unnervingly calm. But the silence was not the same. It was deeper now, pressing into her chest. Lena's fingers brushed against the door handle, her breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. She twisted it. The door wouldn't open. She pulled harder, panic beginning to swell in her chest as the door stubbornly refused to budge. She was trapped, stuck in this room, surrounded by the oppressive, heavy air and the creeping unease that threatened to swallow her whole. Then, as though it was an answer to her mounting dread, a voice whispered, soft, lilting, like a melody that echoed from the very walls themselves. It wasn't loud, but it was clear as day. "You shouldn't have come." Lena's body went rigid. She turned slowly, scanning the empty room, looking for the source. The voice hadn't come from the mirror. It hadn't come from anywhere human. It was the house itself, the voice of its history, of everything that had happened here in the years before. Her eyes locked with the mirror once more, and that's when she saw it. The reflection was no longer hers. It was Sarah O'Bannon, the aunt whose legacy had now thrust her into this nightmare. Lena's knees went weak, and she stumbled back, falling to the floor with a sharp thud. The figure in the mirror, Sarah, smiled. But this smile wasn't warm or welcoming. It was cruel. It was twisted. "The blood is the key, Lena. You'll see. You'll understand soon enough." The mirror rippled like water again, the reflection distorting before it returned to its original state. But this time, the house itself seemed to groan in response, the walls shaking ever so slightly, the floorboards creaking beneath her. Lena scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding, and she forced herself to look away from the mirror. With trembling hands, she tried the door again. This time, it gave way with a reluctant groan, swinging open into the dark hallway beyond. She didn't dare look back. She ran. The house felt like it was alive, its rooms shifting, twisting, warping. It was as if the very walls were closing in, as if the house was trying to swallow her whole. She bolted down the hallway, her mind racing, her breath ragged. The house seemed to stretch forever. How could it be so big, so empty? Lena skidded into the living room. The air colder here, the shadows longer. She froze. The large windows that lined the far wall had been cracked open, their jagged edges catching the dim light. And outside, across the overgrown lawn, she saw something. Someone. A figure stood at the edge of the forest, staring at her. Her pulse spiked. The figure's shape was indistinct, barely visible through the mist that had begun to roll in, but Lena could feel its gaze. She could feel its eyes on her, cold and predatory. It was as though the thing out there, whatever it was, had been waiting for her, watching her, even before she arrived. The figure moved suddenly, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Lena didn't wait to see where it went. She turned and ran again, deeper into the house, desperate to find some form of escape, some sign of safety. The house was suffocating her, and with every step she took, the whispers grew louder. Chapter 2. The Hollow Echoes. Lena's feet scraped across the wooden floor as she hurried through the house, her heart a wild thump in her chest. Every corner she turned seemed to hold more shadows, and the air grew heavier with each breath. The old mansion, Hollow's End, had begun to feel less like a place she could call home and more like a mausoleum that had been patiently waiting for her arrival. But the strangest thing wasn't the silence or the oppressive weight of history that hung in the air. It was the subtle presence she felt in every room, the sensation that something was watching her, tracking her every move. She had grown up hearing stories about this place, about her late aunt Sarah O'Bannon, the woman who had left this house to Lena in her will. The stories had always been strange, laced with fear and mystery. But as Lena moved deeper into the house, she began to understand that the stories were more than mere folklore. They were warnings, warnings that her aunt had left for her, entangled in the very fabric of the house. The hallway was long and dimly lit, the only light coming from the faded sconces that clung to the walls like relics of a forgotten time. The air smelled musty, a combination of mildew and the sweet decay of time. As Lena walked down the corridor, she felt a slight draft, something cold and unnatural, brushing against her skin. It sent a shiver down her spine. She looked over her shoulder instinctively, but no one was there. She had to stop herself from turning back. She had come this far. She was determined to uncover the truth about her aunt's legacy, whatever that truth was. The door at the end of the hallway stood slightly ajar, beckoning her forward. It was the study, Sarah O'Bannon's personal sanctuary, where she had spent countless hours before her untimely death. The room felt different now, as if it had been waiting for Lena to enter. She had always been curious about what was behind that door. Her aunt had been a private woman, and no one spoke much about what she did in there. Lena pushed the door open, and the hinges groaned in protest. The study smelled of dust and old paper, the kind of scent that spoke of years of neglect. The furniture, though covered in white sheets, still bore the faint traces of its former elegance. A large mahogany desk sat in the center of the room, its surface cluttered with stacks of yellowed papers and old books. At the far corner of the room was a dusty fireplace, its hearth cold and empty. Lena's eyes fell on a portrait that hung on the far wall, a painting of Sarah O'Bannon, the woman who had once lived here. The image was so lifelike that for a moment, Lena thought the woman in the painting might move, might step out of the frame and speak to her. But the eyes in the portrait, they were unsettling. The gaze was sharp and penetrating, as if the woman in the painting knew more than she should, as if she could see Lena, even after all these years. Lena shuddered and turned her attention to the desk. Her fingers itched to go through the papers to find something, anything that might explain why Sarah had left her this house, why she had been drawn to this place, this cursed place. She ran her fingers over the top of the desk, brushing aside dust and cobwebs. As her hand moved over a small stack of papers, a faint scratching sound echoed through the room. Lena froze. The sound was so subtle, almost imperceptible. But it was there, unmistakable. A scurrying sound, like something small moving in the shadows. She turned toward the corner, but the room was empty. Just the house settling, she whispered to herself. Her voice sounded too loud in the silence, and she quickly regretted breaking it. But as she resumed sifting through the papers, something odd caught her eye. Beneath a pile of old receipts and scribbled notes, she found an envelope, thick, yellowed with age, and sealed with an intricate wax emblem. The seal was unfamiliar to her, a strange symbol that seemed to wriggle when she looked at it too long. Lena's fingers trembled as she broke the seal. Inside the envelope, there was a letter, written in Sarah O'Bannon's neat but hurried handwriting. Lena scanned the first few lines. "My dearest Lena, if you are reading this, then I have not lived to see this day, and the house has passed to you. I trust that you will be able to make sense of it all. But I must warn you, there are things here. Things I have never told you. Things no one should know. The house is alive, Lena. It has a memory, and it remembers everything." Lena's stomach twisted. The words seemed almost like a forewarning, but the chill in her veins deepened when she read further. "There are others who live here, not in the way you think. They are waiting for you, Lena, and when the time comes, you will know what you must do. The house will reveal its secrets to you. But beware, the bloodline you carry is not as simple as you have been led to believe. You are part of something much older than you realize, something that has been bound to this place for centuries. Don't trust anyone, Not even me. The house will try to deceive you. It has done so for years. I have failed. You must not. Love. Sarah. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she read the letter over and over. Each line felt like it was carving its own truth into her mind. The house is alive. It remembers. But what did that mean? What did her aunt mean by bloodline? And who were the others she had spoken of? Suddenly, Lena felt it again. The presence. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was a weight, an oppressive force pressing down on her chest. She could hear something faint, like whispers, but they weren't words. They were more like the soft, haunting melody of a song long forgotten. The whispers felt familiar, though, like a lullaby from her childhood, something she had heard in the deepest recesses of her dreams. A sudden cold gust of wind swept through the room, scattering the papers on the desk. Lena jumped to her feet, her heart racing. She turned around, but the room was still empty. Nothing was there. Yet, the whispers grew louder. "Lena!" they called. A voice, soft and ethereal, a woman's voice, but it wasn't Sarah's. It sounded older, more ancient, like it came from the depths of the earth itself. Lena stumbled backward. She wanted to scream, to flee, but her legs felt like they were made of stone. The whispers. They were calling her name, and they were coming from everywhere. The walls groaned, the windows rattled, the shadows seemed to stretch. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. A sudden, suffocating silence filled the room, and Lena felt the ground beneath her feet shift. She could hear it, clearly now, the faintest sound of footsteps echoing from somewhere within the house. Someone, or something, was moving through the corridors. Slowly, coming closer. Lena swallowed hard, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. She had to get out. But the door was closed. She rushed to it, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself was holding her captive. And then, in the reflection of the darkened window, Lena saw it. A figure standing just behind her, so close that she could feel its breath on the back of her neck. But when she turned around, there was no one there. The figure lingered in the glass, its features barely visible in the low light. But its eyes were open, wide and unblinking, staring directly at her. Lena screamed, and then the room fell into darkness. Chapter 2. The Hollow Echoes continued. Lena stood frozen in place, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the darkness pressed against her from all sides. The figure in the reflection had vanished as quickly as it appeared, but the feeling of its gaze lingered like a weight on her chest. Her pulse thudded in her ears, and for a moment, she wondered if she was losing her grip on reality. The room seemed to tilt at an unnatural angle, as if the walls themselves were shifting under some unseen force. But that was impossible, wasn't it? Just the house settling, she repeated to herself. But even her own voice seemed unnerving, hollow, echoing in the cavernous silence of the room. Lena turned back to the window, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. She had to remain rational. There had to be an explanation. This was an old house, full of drafts and old wood, strange reflections and unexplainable noises. It was just old. She gripped the edge of the windowsill tightly, staring out into the desolate landscape. The wind howled outside, making the tree branches sway in a twisted dance, their gnarled fingers scratching at the windows as though trying to claw their way in. But all the while, that voice echoed in her mind, the whispered calls that had swept through the room like the softest breath of wind. Lena! The house had once belonged to Sarah O'Bannon, and it was impossible not to feel the weight of her aunt's memory in the air. Thick, oppressive, like a fog that refused to dissipate. But this was more than that. The house seemed alive, not in the way of a mere building filled with memories, but as something sentient, aware of Lena's presence, and perhaps even waiting for her to make her move. She had spent years away from Hollow's End, but now that she was here, it felt as though it had been waiting for her, pulling her back, like a trap slowly closing in. The door behind her creaked loudly, and Lena snapped around, her breath caught in her throat. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end as she glanced at the wooden door. She was sure she had closed it, hadn't she? The shadows within the room seemed to deepen, stretching unnaturally towards the entrance. It's the wind, she told herself. Just the wind, but deep down, something gnawed at her. A primal instinct that told her something was terribly wrong. She had to leave the study. Now, with a nervous glance over her shoulder, Lena took one last look at the desk. She wasn't sure if she should be looking for more answers, if she was ready to confront whatever dark truth had been buried in this place. But her hand reached out nonetheless, drawn to the pile of papers. As her fingers brushed the yellowed edges of the letters, something heavy crashed to the floor behind her. She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. There was nothing. The room seemed untouched, yet the sound lingered in her ears, echoing against the wooden beams above. There was no mistaking it. Something, or someone, had just knocked over one of the furniture pieces. Lena's pulse quickened, her feet rooted to the floor as she fought the urge to run. Her eyes flicked to the hallway outside the room, a faint light seeping from the crack under the door. The house felt suffocating. She couldn't stay here. The whispers returned, so soft, so faint. It was like they were coming from a faraway place, but they were unmistakable, clear as day now. Lena! Her mind raced as the voice seemed to grow louder, more insistent. It was calling to her, but it didn't sound like her aunt's voice. No. It sounded older, deeper, filled with the gravity of ages past. She could feel it, the urgency behind it, the need. She gripped the letter she had found, her fingers curling tightly around the edges of the paper. The writing was still fresh in her mind. The warning her aunt had left. The house is alive. It remembers everything. There are others here. Others. Lena's heart skipped a beat. Who was her aunt talking about? And why did she feel as though these words were not just meant to explain the house, but something far darker, something more sinister that had been watching her since her arrival? The air in the room shifted. The shadows grew, moving like liquid across the floor, as if they were alive, a sentient entity wrapping itself around her. The walls creaked and groaned, as though the house itself was breathing, exhaling the suffocating breath of the ages. Lena's eyes flicked towards the study door, still slightly ajar. That's when she heard it. A faint tapping. It was coming from somewhere behind the walls. She couldn't tell if it was just the house settling again, or something far more unnatural. The sound seemed deliberate, as if someone, or something, was trying to get her attention. The taps were rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, pulsing through the floorboards. The shadows on the walls began to twist and writhe, elongating like dark tendrils stretching toward her. A cold gust of wind blew through the room, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay, of earth that had not seen the light of day for far too long. No, Lena thought, this isn't real. It can't be real. But even as she thought it, she felt a chill creep down her spine, an icy hand that seemed to clutch her very soul. And then the whispers began again, louder this time, swirling in the air like a dark chant. Lena, come closer. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs refused to move. Her body felt rooted to the floor, trapped in the room as the shadows closed in. The air grew colder, and a deep sense of dread flooded her chest. She felt the weight of history pressing down on her. This house had seen too much, and now it was calling her into its grasp. The tapping grew louder, more frantic. She turned back to the letter in her hands, the words from her aunt ringing in her ears. The house is alive. There are others here. But who were they? And why was it calling her? Her gaze shifted back to the painting of Sarah O'Bannon on the wall. The woman in the portrait stared at her with unblinking eyes, and it was then Lena realized. The eyes were moving. They followed her every motion, tracking her every step. The smile on Sarah's painted face twisted into something darker, something mocking. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the room began to close in. The walls seemed to warp, the edges of the furniture distorting, as though the house itself was breathing. Alive, just as her aunt had warned. She could feel its presence in every corner, in every shadow, in the very air she breathed. The door. She had to reach the door. Lena stumbled forward, but before she could take a step, the tapping stopped. The air grew utterly still. The silence was deafening. Then came the voice again, this time in a low, guttural whisper, thick with ancient power. "Come, join us." The ground trembled beneath her feet, and Lena's heart lurched as the darkness around her seemed to pulse, hungry, yearning. She wasn't sure if she was hearing the house, or if it was something deeper, something more monstrous that had been trapped here for centuries. Her hands shook as she reached for the doorknob. And in that moment, the whispering stopped. The shadows receded. The house fell silent. For a brief, terrifying instant, Lena thought it was over, that she had somehow escaped the grip of the house's strange, dark presence. But as she turned the doorknob and stepped out into the hallway, she realized it wasn't over. The house had only just begun. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Walls. Lena's pulse quickened as she stepped out of the study, the heavy door clicking shut behind her with an almost finality, as if the house were sealing her in. The hallway stretched before her, long and narrow, dimly lit by the flickering lamps that seemed too far apart. The wallpaper, faded and peeling, swelled with age, clinging desperately to the walls like the remnants of a forgotten time. The house felt different now, more oppressive, as though the very air had thickened, making it harder to breathe. There was no immediate threat, no creature lurking in the shadows. But there was something else, something subtle, something that weighed down the space around her. A sense of being watched, or worse, known. The door she had just emerged from seemed distant now, like a door she had never opened at all. The passageway felt endless, stretching on far beyond the physical limits of the house, spiraling into some other dimension, a place where reality and nightmare blurred. The faint whisper from earlier still echoed in her ears, and though the voice was gone, the feeling it left behind remained. The house had shifted once again. Lena's eyes darted to the left, where the stairs spiraled up into the darkness. The dim light from below seemed to shrink as the shadows above deepened, making her instinctively hesitate. There was something at the top of the stairs. Something waiting. "It's just the house, Lena. It's all in your head," she told herself. But the whisper, so faint and yet so insistent, gnawed at her, tugging at the edges of her sanity. She had to know, find the source. The thought settled in her mind like a seed, taking root, growing into something dangerous. What had Sarah known? What had she hidden in this house? If she could just understand the cause of the strange occurrences, if she could just unlock the secrets hidden in the walls of Hollow's End, perhaps she could free herself of its grip. The stairs creaked under her weight as she ascended, each step adding to the growing dread that gnawed at her. The soft, rhythmic tapping had started again, but this time, it was not coming from behind the walls. It was coming from above, from the very ceiling, as though the house itself were shifting, bending, and stretching. The sound grew louder with each step, echoing in her skull until it felt as though the tapping was inside her mind. She reached the landing, and the whispers grew louder still. "Lena!" She stopped at the threshold of a long corridor, dim and filled with shadows. The air here was thick, close, like a room sealed off from the world outside. Something was hidden here, something that had been buried in the fabric of the house for years, centuries even. The walls seemed to pulse with a strange, unnatural rhythm, as though the house itself had a heartbeat. A door at the end of the hallway creaked open, just a crack, the faintest whisper of movement in the silence. Lena hesitated, but the pull was too strong. She couldn't ignore it. The door had been waiting for her. You have to see it. You have to know. Taking a deep breath, Lena walked towards the door. As she passed the darkened rooms lining the hall, the shadows seemed to lean toward her, as if reaching out to pull her deeper into the darkness. Her fingers brushed the cold brass knob, and the door swung open with a loud, mournful groan, revealing an old, unused bedroom. The room was freezing, the air inside bitterly cold. The bed, a massive four-poster, was draped in moth-eaten sheets, and the windows were cracked, letting the wind howl through the gaps. But it wasn't the chill that caught Lena's attention. It was the smell. A musty, rancid odor, like decay and wet earth, clung to the air. The floorboards groaned as if the room itself were shifting beneath her feet. But it wasn't just the smell. It was the presence. The feeling that something was here. Something just out of sight. Waiting. Lena stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of what might be hidden here. At first, all she could see were the remnants of a forgotten life. A broken mirror on the wall, a chair turned sideways, and the pale light from the cracked windows casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. But then, her gaze was drawn to something in the corner of the room. A small, old chest. Its wood faded and worn with age. It was closed. But as her eyes locked onto it, she felt the undeniable sensation that it was waiting for her to approach, waiting for me to open it. She couldn't explain why, but she felt drawn to it. It wasn't a logical thought. There was no reason for it, but she moved toward the chest, as though some invisible force had taken control of her limbs. Her fingers brushed the lid, cold and rough under her touch. And then, before she could stop herself, she lifted it. The contents of the chest were as old as the house itself. Dust swirled in the air, and the smell of decay intensified as Lena peered inside. The chest was filled with old, yellowed papers. Papers covered in symbols she couldn't recognize. But among them, something else caught her attention. A single book, its cover bound in faded leather, its pages curling at the edges with age. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, the book seeming to pulse in her grasp, as though it had a life of its own. The instant her fingers touched the cover, the room seemed to change. The shadows thickened, swirling around her, until they obscured the corners of her vision. The book seemed to hum in her hands, vibrating with an energy that felt wrong, ancient, and alive. She opened it. The pages inside were covered in a script she didn't understand. Cryptic, flowing, like a language not meant for mortal eyes. Yet as she read the first few lines, a strange sensation washed over her, as though the words were being whispered into her mind, rather than read from the page. Hollow's End. The words echoed in her head, growing louder with each sentence. The house is not a place, but a curse. Lena's pulse quickened, her breathing shallow. She felt her body tremble as the words seemed to burrow into her skin. They weren't just words. They were a part of the house, a part of its twisted living history. It waits for you to come, to awaken the truth. You are the key. The world around Lena seemed to dissolve, the room fading into darkness, and she was left standing alone in the void. She heard the whisper again, but this time it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside her mind, inside her very soul. "Come closer, Lena," the voice beckoned. "You are part of it now." She slammed the book shut, her heart pounding in her chest. The darkness didn't dissipate, but the voice did. For now, at least. The shadows still lingered, but they seemed to recoil, as though afraid of what she might do next. Breathing heavily, Lena backed away from the chest. She couldn't stay here. The house had already started to twist her mind, warp her reality, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep herself grounded in the present. "I need answers," she thought, her mind spinning. But the book's words echoed again. She was the key. The house was waiting for her. And somewhere, deep within the walls of Hollow's End, she knew that the truth was waiting too. Chapter 4. The Whispering Shadows. The air inside Hollow's End had grown heavier, thick with an invisible pressure that made it difficult to think, let alone move. Lena's legs felt leaden as she stood at the base of the staircase, eyes drawn to the darkness at the top, a void that felt both inviting and foreboding. Something was waiting up there. She hadn't dared to go back up the stairs since the night she'd first arrived. It was only now, in the wake of the unsettling experience in the study, that her instincts seemed to pull her toward that dark, looming upper floor. She wasn't sure why, but she couldn't ignore the pull. With each step, the silence around her seemed to thicken, wrapping her in a cold embrace. The faint, sour scent of mildew hung in the air, mixing with the underlying mustiness of old wood. Her eyes strained to see, but the shadows at the top of the stairs had a weight of their own, as though they moved with a mind of their own. The house felt like it was alive in ways she couldn't quite explain. The floorboards creaked under her weight, but she barely noticed them anymore, as if her presence had become a part of the house itself. It was as if she was fading, becoming an unseen part of the walls, the floors, the air. Lena reached the top of the staircase, her breath shallow, her heartbeat quickening. A thin sliver of moonlight bled through a high window at the end of the corridor, casting the long hall in pale silver light. The narrow space ahead seemed endless, stretching forward like a deep, impenetrable void. Yet, there was a strange comfort in it too, as though she were meant to walk this path. She turned to the door on her left, the same door she had avoided for days. The room beyond it was always closed, and it had always felt wrong, a place her mind had instinctively avoided when she first moved in. The door stood ajar now, a sliver of blackness beckoning her in. Without thinking, Lena stepped forward. Her fingers brushed the old wooden frame as she pushed the door open fully, the heavy hinges creaking with a sound like a groan of protest. The room beyond was larger than she had imagined. Dust motes floated in the air like tiny stars in the pale light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. There was an overwhelming sense of being watched, as though something, or someone, was waiting for her to make the next move. The furniture in the room was sparse but significant. An antique armchair sat in one corner, its upholstery dark and threadbare. A desk stood against the opposite wall, a tattered chair pushed up to it, and there, in the center of the room, was an old bed. The sheets were yellowed, the fabric stiff with age. The bed seemed out of place in its pristine, untouched condition. Too clean, too orderly in a house that had long since fallen into disrepair. Lena's feet moved toward the bed, almost as if guided by an unseen hand. The floor beneath her was colder than she remembered, the chill seeping into her bones. She sat down carefully, her breath coming out in shallow bursts as her eyes roamed the room, looking for something, anything, that would make sense of the creeping sensation in her chest. It was then that she noticed it. A small, delicate figure had been painted on the far wall, just barely visible beneath the dust and grime that had built up over the years. At first, it looked like a smear, but as Lena focused, the details became clearer. A child, no more than 5 or 6, standing alone in a field of tall, sickly grass. The child's face was turned to the side, and there was something in the way the figure had been painted that made her feel uneasy. There was a sadness in the child's eyes. And more than that, there was a sense of knowing, an unsettling awareness in those hollow, unblinking eyes. The hairs on Lena's neck stood on end. The child didn't belong here. The painting wasn't a piece of art. It was something else entirely. Something that didn't belong in a room like this, in a house like this. The room itself felt wrong, warped, as though reality had been distorted here, twisted into something unrecognizable. She stood up abruptly, her legs trembling. But the moment she turned, she froze. The door had closed behind her. Her heart hammered in her chest, and panic surged through her veins. She rushed toward the door, pulling at the handle with frantic urgency, but it wouldn't budge. She yanked harder, her nails scraping against the old wood, but the door was solid, unyielding. A soft, gentle sound reached her ears. A whisper. No, not a whisper, a hum. A low, soothing hum that seemed to echo through the walls themselves. It was a voice, faint and indistinct at first, but it became clearer with each passing second, as though someone, or something, was singing to her. The melody was sweet, familiar, but also wrong. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the voice grew louder. The song seemed to come from the walls, from the very air around her, wrapping her in a cocoon of sound. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror, but there was no one there. Nothing. The hum became a chant, a voice, a woman's voice, low and crooning. The words were impossible to understand, a language Lena had never heard, but the tone was unmistakable. It was calling to her, and then she saw it. From the far corner of the room, the bed began to move. Not in the way furniture moves when disturbed. This was something different. The bed lifted slowly, the mattress rising with an unnatural, fluid motion. It hovered, just for a second, before it settled back down. a heavy thud that vibrated through the floor beneath Lena's feet. The whispering grew louder. Lena stepped back, her mind racing, but her legs refused to move. She couldn't run. She couldn't breathe. She could only stand there, frozen, as the air grew colder, the walls closing in around her. The child in the painting now had its face turned directly toward her, its eyes wide open, its mouth forming a silent scream. A soft, delicate voice, as clear as day, whispered through the room. "You're not supposed to be here." Lena's heart stopped. She felt her limbs go cold, her body frozen in terror. The voice seemed to come from all directions now, from the walls, from the bed, from the very air. The hum turned into words. Words that meant something, but that she could never understand. Before she could react, the door swung open behind her with a deafening crash. Lena stumbled backward, her body moving on instinct as she turned toward the sound. The hallway outside was dark, but she could see something moving there, something large and looming. It was waiting. Without a second thought, Lena dashed toward the open doorway. The voice in the room reached a fever pitch, and the walls seemed to pulse with a rhythm of their own, closing in on her, trapping her. She didn't look back. As her feet hit the hallway, the door slammed shut with an ear-splitting bang. Lena collapsed against the wall, breathless, her heart racing, as she realized, deep in the pit of her stomach, that the house, Hollow's End, was not just a house. It was alive, and it was hungry. Chapter 5. Beneath the Surface. Lena's mind raced as the creature's breath, foul and heavy, washed over her. Her body trembled, but the terror that surged through her veins paralyzed her, binding her in place. The figure was still just a shadow, a barely tangible shape that seemed to distort and flicker in the dim light of the basement. Her legs would not move, no matter how hard she willed them to. For a long moment, the only sound was her own ragged breathing. Then, the creature's low growl broke the silence, like the growl of a starved beast. Its mouth stretched wider, and the scent of decay and death filled the air, wrapping itself around her like a suffocating fog. "You can't escape," the thing whispered, its voice like nails scraping against stone, its words filled with malice and hunger. "You never could. You're part of us now." Lena's stomach twisted in agony, her mouth dry as dust. Every instinct she had screamed for her to flee, to run out of this cursed house and never look back. But she was trapped. Trapped by the house, trapped by the darkness, trapped by the suffocating terror that seemed to rise from the very bowels of the earth. She glanced around wildly, looking for an escape, but the shadows were alive. Every inch of the basement seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, the walls closing in, the ground shifting beneath her feet. The creature advanced toward her slowly, its long, spindly arms outstretched, its claws scraping against the stone floor. "You cannot hide from the truth," it crooned, its voice more intimate now, like a lover's whisper, thick with promise and threat. "You've always known what this house was. You've always known what it wanted. Now, it's time for you to become a part of it." The weight of its words pressed down on Lena like a vice. But it wasn't just the creature's voice that terrified her. It was the house itself. She could feel the foundation of Hollow's End shifting beneath her feet, groaning like a living thing, like it was awakening from a long slumber. Every crack in the stone, every whisper of the wind, every flicker of shadow seemed to beckon her deeper into its hellish depths. A sound echoed in the distance, a loud thump, then another, followed by a series of quick rhythmic thuds. The creature paused, its head tilting as though listening to something unseen. The air in the basement seemed to freeze, holding its breath. Lena didn't dare make a sound, her heart beating so loudly she thought it might burst from her chest. Her eyes locked onto the thing that loomed before her, and for a split second, she could have sworn its face. It changed. The shadows around it shifted, and its hollow eyes seemed to deepen, as though they were pulling her in. It was as though it could see inside her mind, reading her every fear, every secret. And then it smiled, a twisted, jagged smile that stretched impossibly wide, filling the basement with an eerie sense of finality. "You will not escape," it said, the words more sinister than ever. "You're part of the house now, and the house, it never lets go." Lena's body jolted, her instincts kicking in as a surge of adrenaline broke through the paralysis. She forced herself to move, stumbling backward toward the stairs. But before she could take another step, the creature's long fingers shot out and wrapped around her ankle with the force of a vice. Pain exploded in her leg as she fell to the cold, stone floor, the world spinning around her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to kick the creature off, but its grip was like iron. Her limbs were weak, her strength draining away with each passing second. It dragged her back toward the darkness, its eyes gleaming with hunger, its mouth stretching wider, its jagged teeth shining in the faint light. You don't have a choice. But then, something changed. The floor beneath them trembled. The walls seemed to shift, groaning and cracking, as though the house itself was fighting against the creature. Lena could feel the vibration beneath her fingers as she clawed at the floor, her breath coming in desperate gasps. The creature snarled, its grip tightening around her ankle, but the ground buckled, the floor cracking wide open beneath them, swallowing them both into the abyss. Lena screamed, but her voice was lost in the deafening roar of the house. The world spun around her as the ground gave way, the darkness pulling her down, deeper and deeper into a place where light and sound no longer existed. Pastams, or the fall seemed endless, the darkness consuming everything. Lena felt her body tumbling through the void, her breath caught in her throat, unable to scream, unable to think. She hit the ground with a sickening thud, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. Her vision swam as she struggled to sit up, her limbs aching, her head spinning. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the basement. She was somewhere else, somewhere worse. The air was thick with the stench of rot and decay. The ground beneath her was slick, wet, and her hands sank into something foul as she tried to push herself up. She pulled her hands away in horror, only to find them covered in dark, viscous liquid that clung to her skin like tar. And then she saw it. At first, she thought it was another shadow, another trick of her mind. But no, this was real and horrifying. The walls were lined with flesh, twisted, grotesque masses of skin and bone, pulsating and breathing as if they were alive. The floor too was covered in the same grotesque material, as if the entire place was made of bodies, of dead things pressed together, their lifeless eyes staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Her mind reeled as she pushed herself to her feet, her breath ragged and shallow. This place, this thing, it was no longer just a house. It was a living nightmare, a grotesque thing that fed on souls, that consumed all who dared enter. It was the heart of Hollow's End, the place where the darkness truly thrived. And in the distance, barely visible in the shadows, Lena could see them. Hundreds, thousands. Faces pressed against the walls, their eyes empty and wide, their mouths twisted into silent screams. Souls that had been trapped here, just like her. And they were waiting for her to join them. "You're here now." The voice returned, thick with satisfaction, "and you will stay. Forever." Lena's heart sank into the pit of her stomach as she backed away, her mind barely able to comprehend the horrors around her. She turned, but the way out had disappeared. There was no door, no light, no escape. She was trapped in the heart of Hollow's End, and there would be no way out. Chapter 5. The Endless Void. Lena's breath came in ragged gasps, her chest heaving as she stood surrounded by the pulsating mass of flesh and bone. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the stench of rot and death that clung to everything. Her hands trembled as they touched the cold, slick walls, pulling away as though the very skin of the house was alive, repelling her touch. The faces, she could still see them, even when her eyes were closed. Those hollow eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and something darker, something far more sinister. They seemed to follow her every movement, their silent screams echoing in her mind, reverberating through her skull. They were waiting, as if they were all stuck in this eternal, hellish state, bound to the very walls of the house, their souls trapped within the nightmare that it had become. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as the reality of her situation settled in. She wasn't just in the basement anymore. She wasn't even in the house. This place, the walls, the floor, the air itself, was part of something far older, far more malevolent than she could comprehend. It was a place outside of time, outside of space, where every corner seemed to pulse with a grotesque life of its own. There was no escape, no way out. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a noise, a scraping sound, low and guttural, like nails being dragged across stone. Lena spun around, her eyes searching desperately for the source of the sound, but all she could see were the endless faces, their eyes fixed on her, their mouths unmoving, their cries silent. The scraping grew louder, more insistent, as if something, or someone, was approaching. Then, from the darkness ahead, a figure emerged. It was a woman, or at least what used to be a woman. Her body was twisted, her skin stretched tight over an unnaturally thin frame, her eyes wide and glassy, staring straight at Lena. The woman's mouth hung open in an eternal scream, but no sound came out. Her hands reached forward, fingers elongated and gnarled, as if begging for something, or perhaps for someone. Lena recoiled, but her legs refused to move. She was rooted to the spot, her body refusing to obey her mind. The figure came closer, and Lena could feel the air grow colder, heavier, as if the very space around her was thickening, pressing in on her from all sides. The woman's body twitched and jerked with unnatural spasms, her mouth opening wider and wider until it seemed to stretch beyond the limits of her face. Then, just as Lena thought she might scream, the woman collapsed onto the floor in front of her, her body twisting and writhing as though it were being pulled apart from within. Lena took a shaky step back, her hands instinctively reaching for her head, trying to block out the image, but it was impossible. The woman's eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment, Lena saw it. The thing that lay beneath the surface of this wretched place. It wasn't just the house that was alive. The souls of the lost, the trapped, the damned. They were the house. They were the walls. They were the floor. They were the very essence of the dark force that had claimed this place, this dimension, as its home. And now they were reaching out for her, pulling her into their endless nightmare. The woman's lips parted one last time, and Lena could hear her voice, a faint whisper, almost drowned out by the scratching sounds that echoed from all directions. "You will never be free." The words sent a shock of ice through Lena's veins, but before she could react, the woman's body convulsed violently, and the floor beneath her cracked open with a deafening roar. The floor gave way completely, swallowing the woman whole. Lena stumbled back, barely managing to catch herself on the slick, wet wall. Her breath caught in her throat as the sound of something shifting echoed around her. From the abyss below, another shape emerged, this one larger, darker, and far more horrifying. It was a man, or at least, it resembled a man, though his body was misshapen and twisted, his limbs far too long and thin, his head grotesquely deformed. His skin was mottled, greyish, and covered in boils that oozed a thick black liquid. His eyes were wide and bulging, black voids that seemed to suck the very light out of the room. The figure advanced toward Lena, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. Lena's heart hammered in her chest as she stumbled backward, her body finally obeying her and moving away from the grotesque thing. The man, if he could even be called that, stopped just a few feet in front of her, his mouth opening wide as if to speak. But instead, a low, guttural growl emanated from his throat. The sound vibrated through the floor, rattling her bones, making her teeth ache. And then, in a voice that scraped like dry leaves across a stone, he spoke. "You've entered the house of the damned. Now, you will join us. Forever." Lena felt a surge of terror unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was as though the very air was closing in around her, suffocating her, pulling her toward the man's outstretched hand. She tried to move, but her legs were like lead, her feet unable to lift off the ground. The darkness around her seemed to respond to the man's words, swirling and gathering like a storm. It was as though the house itself had come alive, its darkness hungry, eager to claim her. "You cannot escape," the man's voice echoed, repeating the words over and over, growing louder, more insistent. "You cannot escape, Lena. You are one of us. The house will never let you go." Suddenly, the ground beneath Lena's feet gave way again. She screamed, but it was swallowed by the endless blackness that consumed her. This time, there was no falling, There was no sense of motion, just a crushing, suffocating pressure, like the weight of the entire house pressing down on her. Her body felt like it was being pulled in 1,000 directions, her limbs twisting and contorting as if they were being pulled apart. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the pressure stopped. Lena opened her eyes, but the world around her had changed. She was no longer in the nightmarish, grotesque landscape with the faces and the horrors. Now, she was in a dark, empty room. Her body felt heavy, like it was trapped in mud. Her eyes flickered around, trying to make sense of the darkness, but all she could see was the faint outline of a door in front of her. But that was not what terrified her. What terrified her was the feeling, the knowing, that she wasn't alone, that the room was filled with something watching her, waiting for her. "Welcome back." The voice, low, cold and taunting, came from behind her. Lena whipped around, her eyes wide with terror, and there, standing in the doorway, was the man. He was smiling, his mouth stretching impossibly wide, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You thought you could escape. You thought you were free. But you will never be free." Lena's mind reeled as the walls around her seemed to close in, the room shrinking, pressing in on her from all sides. The man's smile grew wider, his form blurring into the darkness, his laughter echoing in her mind. And then, just before everything went black, she understood. She was never meant to escape. She was never meant to leave Hollow's End. She was part of it now, forever. Chapter 6. The Depths of Madness. Lena's mind reeled as she stood in the darkness of the room. The words of the man, no, the creature, still echoed in her ears. A vile whisper that felt as if it were crawling beneath her skin. "You are part of us now." Those words clung to her like an unshakable curse. She didn't know how long she had been standing there. The passage of time was meaningless in this place, this hellish dimension where rules of space and time didn't exist. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a heavy, suffocating presence that made it hard to breathe. Lena clutched her chest, trying to steady her heartbeat, but the panic was suffocating. There was no escape. The thought lingered in her mind like an oppressive cloud, and she could feel it gnawing at the edges of her sanity. Her eyes darted around the dark room, the walls now seeming to pulse with an eerie rhythm, as if they had a life of their own. The shadows in the corners danced like living things, writhing and stretching in unnatural ways, their forms barely visible, but unmistakably ominous. It was then that the floor beneath her feet began to tremble. A low rumble, like the sound of distant thunder, shook the room. Lena's breath hitched in her throat. The sensation wasn't physical. It wasn't like the house itself was shifting. It was deeper, more primal, as if the very air around her was moving, vibrating with a dark, malevolent energy. She stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribcage. Her hand grasped the wall for support, but it felt wrong. The smooth surface beneath her fingers began to undulate, as if it were made of something alive, something that responded to her touch. The sensation was sickening, like touching the skin of a creature that was not meant to exist. The rumble grew louder, and she could feel it reverberating through her bones, sinking deep into her very core. The shadows in the corners of the room began to twist and coil, stretching toward her as though they were sentient, aware of her presence. The air grew colder, and Lena could see her breath now, a thick mist swirling in the stillness. A voice echoed in her mind, so faint at first that she couldn't be sure if it was real or just a figment of her terrified imagination. "Lena, it's time." The voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it felt like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It seeped into her consciousness, sliding through the cracks in her sanity like oil through water. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, her hands trembling as they dug into the cold, damp floor. "You've been chosen," the voice continued, its tone soothing. But there was a cruelty beneath the words, an undercurrent of something darker. "You've crossed the threshold. There's no turning back now." Lena's eyes darted around the room, trying to locate the source of the voice, but the shadows had swallowed everything. The room, the walls, the very air itself seemed to close in on her, pressing in like a suffocating blanket. She gasped for air, but the oppressive darkness made it harder to breathe, each breath more labored than the last. Her vision blurred as the shadows moved closer, the edges of her mind fraying like the delicate strands of a spider's web. She felt something crawl across her skin, cold and slimy, as though invisible hands were caressing her body, touching her with a terrible, unseen presence. She shuddered, her body trembling uncontrollably. Then the rumbling stopped. For a moment there was silence, a thick, suffocating silence that stretched out like a wound, bleeding dread into the air. Lena looked up, her eyes wide with terror, and saw the figure before her. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The figure was a mass of shadows, a shifting, dark form that seemed to absorb the very light around it. Its features were obscured, but Lena could feel its gaze upon her, a burning, empty stare that pierced through her like an icy needle. There was no face, no eyes, just an all-encompassing void where a soul should have been. The air around her seemed to warp, twisting in unnatural patterns, and the walls began to crack open, revealing glimpses of the abyss beyond. She could hear distant wails, faint and eerie, as if millions of lost souls were crying out from the void. The room was no longer solid, no longer real. "It has begun," the voice said again, now louder, more commanding. "You are the key. The house is hungry, Lena. It's calling for you." Lena's heart slammed against her chest, her pulse quickening as panic began to rise once more. Her thoughts raced, desperate for a way out, but every option felt like an illusion. She had to get out. She had to escape this place. But how? And then, in the center of the room, the shadows parted. A doorway appeared, but it wasn't a doorway like any she had seen before. It was a portal, an entrance to a place so dark, so twisted, that Lena could feel its pull, its hunger, deep within her bones. "You will come to us, Lena. There is no escaping your fate." With a cry of terror, Lena leaped to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her as she scrambled toward the door. But no matter how fast she ran, it felt as though the distance between her and the exit was growing longer, stretching out like a cruel joke. The shadows surged forward, clawing at her skin, tugging at her clothes, dragging her back into the darkness. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. The voice returned, its tone now mocking. "There is no escaping. You will never be free." Lena could feel her sanity slipping away, like sand through her fingers. The air around her grew heavier, suffocating, until every breath felt like a battle. The room swirled around her, spinning in a dizzying blur as the darkness closed in on all sides. She felt herself falling into an endless abyss, into a void where nothing made sense and nothing mattered. "Join us," the voice whispered, this time with a chilling intimacy. "Become one with us, forever." And just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, as her mind began to fracture under the weight of the horror pressing in on her, she felt it. A hand, cold and smooth, gripped her wrist, pulling her backward. She screamed. Chapter 6. The Depths of Madness, Part 2. Lena's mind struggled to regain any semblance of control, but it was like trying to hold on to sand slipping through her fingers. The hand that gripped her wrist was ice cold, sending shockwaves through her body. It wasn't just physical, it was a presence, something that left a mark on her very soul. She tried to scream, but the air around her was thick, like an invisible weight pressing on her chest, suffocating her. Her throat tightened as the sounds of the world around her became muffled, like listening from beneath a heavy blanket of water. Her own pulse thudded in her ears, loud and deafening, each beat echoing with the rhythm of impending doom. The hand that held her wasn't human. She could feel it. She could sense the wrongness of it. The skin, or what she assumed was skin, was unnaturally smooth, too cold, too perfect. It didn't have the warmth of life. It was more like an extension of the darkness that surrounded her. "Where are you taking me?" she thought desperately, her mind screaming for some explanation, some release. But the hand didn't answer. It didn't need to. Without warning, The world tilted. The floor beneath her feet gave way, and Lena found herself falling. Her stomach lurched as gravity twisted, pulling her downward at an unnatural angle. She tried to scream again, but the sound was lost to the void, as if the darkness had swallowed her very existence. The fall seemed endless, as though the ground itself had opened up into an abyss that stretched far beyond what should have been possible. The walls of the void around her were slick and slimy, pulsating with a sickening rhythm, as if the entire dimension she was trapped in was alive, breathing, watching. As she plummeted deeper, the air grew colder, colder than she had ever felt in her life. It wasn't just cold, it was frigid, a biting cold that pierced her skin and reached into her bones, freezing her from the inside out. Lena shut her eyes, trying to block out the sensation of spiraling through darkness. The terror surged through her again, panic clawing at her chest as she realized that she had no idea where she was headed, no idea if she would ever stop falling. Please, please make it stop, she thought, clinging desperately to the last shreds of her sanity. But the abyss only grew deeper, and the cold only became more unbearable. Suddenly, the fall halted. The abrupt stop made Lena's stomach lurch violently, and she staggered backward, her legs buckling beneath her as the sudden shift sent waves of nausea through her. Her hands shot out instinctively to steady herself, and she found herself standing on solid ground, though she couldn't remember when the fall had ended. She opened her eyes. Before her stood an enormous door. No, a gate, a monstrous structure that loomed over her like a spectre from some ancient, forgotten time. It was made of blackened iron, its surface twisted and etched with symbols she didn't recognize, symbols that seemed to shift as she looked at them, each one more alien and incomprehensible than the last. Lena took a step forward, though her legs trembled with fear. She didn't know why, but something about the door called to her. It beckoned her, drawing her in with an irresistible pull that she couldn't fight. There was no choice but to move forward. As she stepped closer, a sound filled the air, a soft, whispering hum. It was like the door itself was alive, like it was breathing, waiting. The hum grew louder, filling her mind, drowning out everything else. The closer Lena got to the door, the more she could feel the whispers tugging at her thoughts, like they were trying to burrow into her mind. "Welcome home, Lena." The voice was like velvet, smooth and cold, wrapping around her consciousness like a shroud. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive in any real sense. It was other, something ancient, something that had waited for far too long. Before she could react, the door creaked open. It moved with an eerie, unsettling slowness, revealing nothing but blackness beyond it, a vast, empty void that seemed to stretch on for eternity. Lena's heart raced. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and run, to escape whatever force was pulling her toward the door, but her body betrayed her. Her feet moved forward, step by slow step, as if her own legs were no longer under her control. The air grew even colder, and the hum of the door's whispering intensified, vibrating in her bones. Her hand reached out toward the door, her fingers trembling, her mind screaming for her to stop, but she couldn't. She couldn't break free from the pull, the weight of inevitability settling over her. Then, just as her fingers brushed the cold metal of the doorframe, she felt it. A sharp, jagged pain shoot through her hand. Her body jerked backward, but the force wasn't enough to break her hold on the door. She looked down. Where her fingers had touched the doorframe, black tendrils had begun to coil around her hand. They were like serpents, thin, slick, and impossibly fast, wrapping around her wrist, binding her to the door with an iron grip. The more she struggled, the tighter they became, their pressure unbearable, as though they were feeding on her very life force. A voice, not her own, echoed through her mind. "You cannot escape, Lena. You are already ours." The tendrils pulled harder, dragging her into the door's dark abyss. She screamed, her voice a desperate, empty cry that was swallowed by the surrounding darkness. And then, the door slammed shut behind her. Lena stood alone in the void, the whispers now all around her, pressing in on her from every direction. They weren't speaking to her. They were speaking through her, a chorus of voices that dripped with malice. Her eyes darted around the dark space, but she could see nothing, nothing but the shadows that loomed like hungry beasts, waiting for her to fall deeper into their grasp. The voices grew louder until they were no longer whispers, but screams, unearthly wails that filled the space with agony and despair. And through it all, one thought clawed at the edge of her mind, refusing to let go. There is no escape. Chapter 7. Whispers of the Forgotten. Lena stood at the threshold of the abyss, her body trembling, heart pounding erratically in her chest. It wasn't a place that could be measured by time or space. It was something else, a realm beyond the limits of human comprehension. An oppressive silence hung over the place, heavy and thick, as if the air itself was saturated with the weight of centuries of forgotten whispers. The dark void around her felt like it had swallowed all light, all hope, and all purpose, leaving nothing but an endless, suffocating blackness. A distant, high-pitched whine pulsed in her ears, like the sound of a needle scraping across a vinyl record. It wasn't a noise that could be pinpointed. It came from everywhere, from within the walls of her mind. The longer Lena stood still, the more the sound grew, burrowing itself deeper into her thoughts, becoming a part of her like a parasite feeding on her sanity. Her breath quickened as the darkness began to shift. It wasn't a subtle movement. No, it was a violent, suffocating shift that seemed to bend reality itself. Something moved in the corners of her vision, a shadow too large to ignore, but too quick to be seen clearly. A tremor of fear shot down her spine, and her instincts screamed at her to flee, to run back to the door that had vanished as soon as it had shut behind her. She tried to turn, but her feet were frozen, planted firmly in place. A chill slithered down her spine, a sharp, biting cold that felt as if it were inside her now, not just around her. Every inch of her body screamed to move, to escape, but the suffocating pressure of the air seemed to hold her fast, binding her to the center of the void like a puppet on invisible strings. The whispers returned, this time louder and clearer, as though they were converging on her from every direction. They came in fragments, snippets of words that didn't quite make sense. They were like fragments of forgotten dreams, sounds that didn't belong, and yet they filled her mind with a chilling certainty. You are here, part of them. You cannot. She could feel them, these voices, wrapping around her consciousness, dragging her into the depths of their madness. They were cold, distant, but familiar, like memories she had buried deep inside her, memories that refused to stay hidden. Her hands trembled at her sides, and she squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the voices, but it didn't work. A shift in the darkness made her open her eyes again, and this time, something was there. Something new, a figure, pale and thin, like a gaunt spectre, emerged from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, its shape stretching into the blackness above. The creature was faceless, or at least it seemed so at first. Its body was an unsettling blend of shadow and substance, a monstrous figure that seemed to writhe and twist as if its form was struggling to maintain itself. It was as if the darkness itself was trying to take shape, but it could not quite manage it. Lena froze. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure moved toward her, its every movement unnatural, jerking like a broken marionette. The figure's limbs stretched impossibly long, each joint snapping as if in protest. It wasn't human, and yet, the longer Lena stared, the more she recognized it. It wasn't the appearance that haunted her. It was the presence. It was something that reached into her very soul, pulling at the deepest corners of her being, whispering to her from a place far beyond this realm. The whispers had grown louder, clearer, more insistent. They wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. You are hers. Already. Lena's chest tightened, her breath caught in her throat. The realization dawned on her like a slow, terrible revelation. She wasn't in some random pocket of darkness. This place, this realm, was waiting for her. It had always been waiting for her, and now it was pulling her in. She was no longer a visitor here. She was becoming a part of it, an unwilling participant in some ancient, forgotten ritual. She could feel it in the air around her, feel the slow, grinding pull of inevitability. As the figure moved closer, It seemed to distort, its edges blurring as though it could barely hold onto its form. Lena's stomach churned in horror as the figure seemed to speak to her without words, sending a shockwave of pure terror into her heart. The whispers, the pressure, the cold. It was all pulling her toward this thing, toward the thing that wanted her. She knew in that moment that whatever it was, it had claimed her. The figure stretched out its long, thin fingers toward her, and Lena's breath faltered. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body betrayed her, as if her soul had already been shackled to this cursed place. The cold fingers brushed against her skin, sending a jolt of pain through her body, a burning sensation that filled every nerve. It wasn't pain, it was something far worse. It was like the darkness itself had seeped into her skin, like it was marking her, branding her as its own. Lena gasped, her knees buckling beneath her as the figure's touch seemed to burn through her very essence. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't think. She felt as though her mind was unraveling, her sense of self slipping away into the abyss. And then, the world around her shifted once again. The figure dissolved into the darkness, leaving nothing behind but the echo of its presence. Lena stood alone, but she wasn't truly alone. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. "You are one of us now. You are home." The voices swirled around her, growing frantic, as if they were feeding off her fear. Lena wanted to scream, to break free, but she couldn't. She was trapped, surrounded by a darkness that seemed to reach into her very soul, pulling her deeper into a nightmare that had no end. But as the last of the figure's presence faded, Lena felt something shift inside her, a terrible, cold realization. She wasn't just trapped in this place. She had become part of it. She had crossed some threshold, some boundary, and now there was no going back. Her eyes widened in horror as she felt the shift, the change taking place within her. Something ancient, something dark, was awakening inside her. She could feel it stirring, moving through her veins, coursing through her blood. It wasn't just the realm that had claimed her. It was something older, something far more powerful than she could comprehend. And in the deepest recesses of her mind, a single thought echoed: "I am becoming one of them." End of chapter 7. Whispers of the Forgotten. This chapter deepens Lena's entrapment in a realm that is not only a place but a consuming ancient force. The intensity increases with the introduction of an unsettling figure and the exploration of Lena's gradual assimilation into the darkness. The tone of dread and inevitability amplifies as Lena realizes that her fate is no longer her own. The whispers of the past and future entwine, bringing forth an eerie sense of being forever lost. If you'd like to continue with the next chapter or need further refinement, feel free to let me know. Chapter 8. The Eyes Beneath the Earth. Lena stumbled through the ever-deepening shadows, her heart a frantic drumbeat in her chest. The whispers, those damned whispers, had only grown louder since the figure had disappeared into the darkness. They weren't just voices anymore. They were thoughts, feeding on her fear, worming their way into her consciousness, pulling at the edges of her mind like parasites. "You are here to stay," they murmured, each word a weight that settled deeper within her. "You have always been here." She squeezed her eyes shut, as if that could block out the terrifying presence surrounding her. But it didn't help. The coldness of the place, the sensation of being watched, it all pressed in, suffocating her, choking her thoughts with its raw, tangible terror. Lena didn't know how long she had been walking. Time had stopped making sense. It felt like hours, days, or perhaps longer. Every step she took seemed to draw her deeper into the very heart of the house, to places that should never have been disturbed. Her legs were heavy, her feet dragging along the uneven, damp ground. It was as though the earth itself had grown tired of holding her up. She could feel the texture of the floor shift beneath her feet, slick, almost wet, like walking on the surface of a living thing. Her steps faltered as she moved forward, hesitant and unsure. The silence around her was broken only by the occasional echo of her breathing, which seemed far too loud in the oppressive quiet. But then, as she reached a distant corner of the room, she heard it. A sound. Soft at first, like the faintest shuffle, a scratch across the stone floor. It grew louder, growing in volume until it was unmistakable, the sound of movement. Lena froze. Her blood ran cold as the hairs on the back of her neck prickled. The very air around her shifted. The shadows twisted, pooling together at the edges of the room as if the darkness itself had a mind of its own, bending toward her, feeding off her fear. Her breath caught in her throat. There was something, someone, moving in the darkness. She could feel it, could almost hear the faint creak of something shifting, something large and hulking dragging itself through the void. But when she turned her head to look, there was nothing, just the empty void, stretching out in all directions, an expanse of darkness with no beginning, no end. Her pulse quickened. She took a step back, but before she could react, a faint whisper curled its way into her mind. "It's already too late, Lena." The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was her own voice, or something that sounded like it. It whispered to her from a place deep within her mind, curling and twisting like smoke, turning her thoughts in on themselves. Too late, she thought. Too late for what? She tried to shake the thought from her head, but the whispers kept coming, relentless, never-ending. "You can't escape. You are part of us now. We will never let you go." Lena pressed her palms to her ears, trying to drown out the voices, but it was no use. The words, the presence, they were her thoughts now. They had infected her, woven their way into her very being until she could no longer tell where her mind ended, and the voices began. Her own thoughts twisted into something else, something darker, as if the house had seeped into her very soul. Then a soft sound broke through the darkness, a faint scraping noise, like something dragging across stone. Lena turned, her heart thundering in her chest. There, at the far end of the room, she saw it, a faint light, flickering in the distance, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. It seemed like the last remnant of hope in this nightmare, a single light in an endless sea of darkness. Without thinking, Lena moved toward it, her legs shaky beneath her, her feet stumbling on the uneven floor. As she drew closer, the light grew brighter, and she could hear the faint murmur of voices, the low hum of something alive, something waiting. The light flickered again, and Lena's pulse quickened. She was almost there, almost at the end of this maze of nightmares. She reached out, her trembling hand brushing against the cold, rough stone of the wall as she moved closer to the light. And then, the floor beneath her feet crumbled. Lena's scream echoed through the endless void as the ground shifted violently, cracking wide open beneath her. The darkness below yawned open like the maw of some terrible beast, ready to consume her. She tried to grab onto anything, but there was nothing. The stone walls crumbled and gave way as she fell, the air rushing past her in a violent rush. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a brief moment, she thought she would lose herself entirely, swallowed by the abyss. But then, suddenly, everything stopped. The fall ended abruptly, like a hand had reached out and caught her. She found herself in another room, but this room wasn't like the others. It wasn't cold, and it didn't feel suffocating. In fact, it was almost peaceful. But there was something wrong with the calm, something unnatural that made her skin crawl. Lena stumbled forward, trying to regain her balance, but the strange feeling in the air kept her on edge. The room was small, dimly lit, but there was a door at the far end, almost beckoning her forward. Her eyes flickered to the sides, but the walls were bare, nothing to suggest what had happened here, or why this place was so different. As Lena moved toward the door, she heard it again, the faint scraping noise. It was coming from the other side of the room, behind her. Slowly, her head turned, and she saw it. The walls, they weren't empty. The walls were breathing. They expanded and contracted, like the chest of some massive beast, the surface rippling like a thick, wet skin. The breath, slow and heavy, pulsed through the room. It was as though the very room was alive, and it was feeding on her terror. Her breath caught in her throat as she backed away, the scraping sound growing louder, and then something moved, a face. Lena's eyes widened in disbelief as a face emerged from the wall. The flesh was soft and wet, the skin stretched too tightly over the bones, the eyes wide, lifeless, and empty. A mouth appeared, forming from the wall's surface, its edges raw and bleeding. It whispered to her, but the words were indistinct, lost in the hiss of the wall's breath. The face twisted, and its mouth opened wider. "Come closer." Lena took a step back, but she couldn't look away. It was as if the face was calling to her, drawing her in with its hollow gaze. She wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. Her body refused to move. She felt as though her legs were rooted to the ground, her feet unwilling to obey her will. The walls began to shake, and the face grew, its features stretching wider, its mouth opening impossibly wide, and then, as if with a sickening snap, the face disappeared back into the wall. Lena gasped for air, her heart racing as she stepped toward the door at the end of the room. She didn't want to look back. She didn't want to stay in this place another moment. As her hand gripped the cold metal of the door handle, she heard it, the softest whisper coming from just behind her. "You can't leave. You belong here." Chapter 8. The Eyes Beneath the Earth. Part 2. Lena's fingers trembled as they curled around the cold metal door handle. The whisper, "You can't leave. You belong here," repeated over and over in her mind, a mantra that clung to the edges of her sanity. She didn't dare look behind her, didn't dare face the grotesque face that had emerged from the wall. The air had thickened, turned sour, and she could taste the weight of fear in every breath. Her heart raced, a wild, frantic thing thudding against her ribs as she twisted the door handle. It felt wrong, the door resisting her touch as if it had a mind of its own. But she didn't stop. She didn't have time to think. She had to escape. With a grunt, she pushed the door open, the hinges creaking as if protesting against her intrusion. The room beyond was bathed in an eerie, pale glow, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched and twisted like phantom limbs. It was a hallway, but it wasn't like any hallway she'd ever seen. The walls were covered in thick, dark vines, writhing and coiling like something alive. There were no windows, no light sources except the faint, almost unnatural luminescence that seeped from the cracks in the walls. The very air felt oppressive, as though it was filled with the weight of countless lost souls, their presence pressing in on her from all sides. Lena hesitated. The door behind her had closed, sealing her inside this place, this labyrinth of unearthly horrors. The shadows in the hallway seemed to reach for her, pulling at her, urging her forward into the unknown. She stepped cautiously, her feet dragging across the floor, her movements slow and deliberate, as if any sudden motion might trigger something unseen. The whispers were louder now. They weren't just voices anymore. They were thoughts, flickering through her mind like fragments of forgotten memories. They clawed at the edges of her consciousness, whispering names, places, events that felt distant and yet intimately familiar. She could no longer distinguish between the voices of the house and her own thoughts. They had become one, feeding into each other in a sickening cycle. "You're one of us now. You've always been one of us," the voices murmured, their words slithering under her skin like a poison. Lena could feel herself weakening. The walls, the darkness, the very air. It was all a part of her now. She had been swallowed whole, consumed by something much darker than she had ever imagined. It was no longer about running, about escaping. It was about survival, but survival meant losing herself. Suddenly, a cold, wet hand brushed against her shoulder. The skin was clammy, unnaturally soft, and the touch sent a violent shiver of terror racing up her spine. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat, but there was nothing there, just shadows. Her heart hammered in her chest, her pulse thundering in her ears. "It's not real," she whispered to herself, trying to steady her shaking hands. "It's not real. It's just in my mind. Just in my mind." But the moment the words left her lips, the hallway around her shifted. The walls seemed to ripple like the surface of a pond, disturbed by a stone, and the air grew thick with the smell of something rotten. A distant sound began to emerge from the depths of the darkness. A low, guttural rumble, like the growl of a beast far beneath the earth. Lena froze. It was as if the very ground beneath her feet had become alive, breathing, shifting in rhythm with the ominous rumble that was growing louder with each passing second. The air was thick with a static charge, and she could feel the hairs on her arms stand on end. The electric pulse of something ancient and unfathomable building all around her. The whispers in her mind were no longer the soft, insidious murmurs of before. They had become a cacophony of voices, all shouting, screaming, begging. You cannot hide. We know you. It's too late for you. You will be part of us, forever. Lena's breath caught in her throat as a sharp, searing pain exploded in her head. It was as though her skull was being crushed from the inside out. A pressure so intense that her vision blurred and her knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed to the floor, her hands gripping the cold stone beneath her as her mind screamed for release. And then, the ground gave way. The hallway before her vanished in an instant, swallowed by a dark, yawning abyss. The floor crumbled beneath her feet, and she was falling, tumbling into the unknown, weightless, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn apart. She tried to scream, but no sound came from her mouth. The darkness consumed her, pulling her deeper and deeper into its endless void. Her body hit the ground with a sickening thud, her vision swimming as she struggled to breathe. The air was thick with dust and decay, the scent of death clinging to everything around her. She gasped for air, the taste of blood and iron thick on her tongue, her mouth dry and bitter. Her limbs ached as though they had been twisted out of shape, and her head throbbed with a dull, relentless pain. When her vision cleared, Lena realized she was no longer in the hallway. She was in a new place, a place of emptiness. She was surrounded by nothing but the black, endless void. No walls, no floors, no ceiling, just nothing. It was as if she had been cast adrift into the fabric of the universe itself, untethered, isolated, but she wasn't alone. Something moved in the dark. Lena's breath caught in her chest as she turned, her eyes straining against the blackness, trying to make sense of the shape that was shifting in the distance. It was too far to make out, too distant to discern, but she could feel it. A presence, cold and malevolent, stretching toward her like a long, clawed hand. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the void, crawling through her mind like insects. They were no longer voices. They were hunger, a terrible, ravenous hunger that clawed at her from within. Come closer. The words were dripping with malice, thick and syrupy, like poison laced with venom. Join us. Become one. Lena's heart hammered in her chest as she stumbled backward. She didn't know where she was, didn't know how she had ended up in this place. But she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't stay here. Whatever it was, whatever they were waiting for her. The longer she stayed, the more she could feel herself slipping away, losing herself to them, to the voices, to the dark. Suddenly, the shape in the distance lunged forward, its form taking shape as it drew closer. It was enormous, a hulking, formless mass of shadow and flesh, with eyes that gleamed like burning coals. Its mouth was a gaping maw, dripping with a black substance that hissed as it touched the floor. Lena turned, her body screaming in protest as she forced her legs to move. She couldn't run, couldn't escape. The presence was everywhere now, surrounding her, consuming her. Every step she took seemed to make the darkness grow tighter around her, as if the world itself was closing in. Her mind raced. She needed to wake up. She had to escape. But there was no escape. The dark shape loomed closer, its eyes fixed on her, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. You are ours. You have always been ours. Lena reached for something, anything, her hands trembling, but there was nothing to grasp. The void had no edges, no shape. She was suspended in its cold embrace, helpless. The darkness closed in, her vision blurred, her heartbeat slowed. And then, silence. Chapter 9. The Whispers of the Forgotten. The heavy air in the room was suffocating, as if each breath was tainted by the weight of 100 unspoken fears. Darkness clung to the corners like something alive, creeping, watching. The faint glow of the old lantern barely pierced the thick shadows, casting long, sinister shapes against the walls. Sarah stood still, her breath shallow, her heart thudding loudly in her chest. It had been hours since she had last spoken to anyone, hours since she had entered this forsaken place. The walls felt like they were closing in, pressing against her in a suffocating grip, as if the very structure of the house was alive. A breathing, sentient entity that fed on fear. The house had never felt this way before. No, she corrected herself. It wasn't the house that was different, it was her. Since that moment, the moment when the whispers started, everything had changed. It started innocently enough, the quiet murmurs at the edges of her thoughts. She had chalked it up to fatigue, the toll of too many sleepless nights, too many unanswered questions. But then the whispers grew clearer, louder, urging her to listen, to obey, to follow the unspoken instructions that only seemed to make sense when the wind howled through the cracks of the house. Listen. The voice was soft, almost seductive, but laced with something darker, something ancient. Sarah had never been one to believe in ghost stories, in haunted houses, or forgotten curses. But now, standing in the midst of this rotting home, she wasn't so sure anymore. You have to finish what was started, the voice whispered again, this time from the corner of the room. She turned her head sharply, her eyes scanning the darkened space, but there was nothing there, only the flickering lantern light casting fleeting shadows across the old wood. Her hand tightened around the lantern's handle, knuckles white, as she slowly backed away from the corner. She had to keep moving. She couldn't let herself stop. The whispers had become unbearable in their persistence, gnawing at her mind, growing louder with every passing moment. The house, it knew her name, and it was waiting. Chapter 9. The Whispers of the Forgotten. Part 2. Sarah's footfalls echoed through the house like the soft tapping of a condemned soul walking toward its fate. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground itself was pulling her deeper into its grasp. The whispers were relentless now, a low hum that seemed to reverberate from every corner, from the very walls themselves. It was as though the house had grown hungry for her, and her fear was the feast it craved. You have to finish what was started. The words came not from the corner this time, but from within her own mind. She could feel the cold pressure of them, seeping through the cracks in her consciousness. Each syllable curled around her thoughts like a vine, strangling them, binding her to something ancient, something monstrous. She pressed her hands to her temples, trying to force the thoughts away, but it was futile. The whispers only grew louder, more insistent, as if the house itself was beginning to breathe with her, feeding off her panic. It's too late for you to leave, Sarah. You've already crossed the threshold. Now, you must do what was intended. You must set us free. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she glanced around the room, but still, no one was there. The walls seemed to be closing in on her, the air thick with an unexplainable heaviness. A cold draft whipped through the room, the lantern flickering violently, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the floor. The coldness was different now. It was no longer just the chill of an abandoned house, but something deeper, something more sinister. It was the biting cold of the grave, the icy fingers of death trailing along her spine. She could feel them, the presences, waiting in the corners of the room, just out of sight, watching her with unseen eyes. Their hunger was palpable, like the smell of decay. She backed into a wall, her mind a whirl of confusion and terror. What do they want from me? The question clawed at her, but there was no answer. The house seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if it was alive, a living, breathing thing that had been waiting for her, specifically for her, for years, decades even. And then, as she watched the shadows twist and shift around her, she saw something that froze her blood. It was a figure, a silhouette, barely visible in the dim light of the lantern, standing motionless at the far end of the room. Tall, thin, its features obscured by the shadow of the hallway. Her heart skipped a beat. She tried to speak, to call out, but no words came. Instead, she could only watch, frozen in place, as the figure seemed to take a slow step forward. Click. The sound of bare feet against the cold wooden floor echoed through the room. And then another step, and another. Each sound vibrated through her chest. each step growing closer, until she could hear the ragged breathing of the thing in the shadows. It was like the sound of someone trying to catch their breath after drowning, an unnatural, rasping inhale that sent chills through her veins. Her mouth went dry. She didn't dare turn away. Her entire body felt like it was bound to the floor, her legs too weak to carry her, too paralyzed by the terror coursing through her veins. "Sarah." The whisper echoed, but it wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from the figure. The tall, dark shape slowly stepping toward her, its form becoming clearer with every passing moment. "I've waited so long for you." It spoke her name. The sound of it, her name spoken in that guttural, rasping voice, made her feel like she was falling, sinking into an endless pit. Her breath hitched, and her pulse raced faster. She wanted to scream, but the words refused to come, and then she saw its face. The lantern's light barely illuminated the room, but enough to reveal the shape of its head. It was pale, too pale, almost translucent, and twisted in a grotesque way. The face was not fully human, the features distorted by years of decay. The skin hung loosely from the bones, and its eyes, black pits, voids where there should have been life, stared at her with a knowing hunger. The smile, though, that smile was the most terrifying part. It wasn't a smile of joy. It wasn't even the twisted grin of madness. No, this smile was something far darker. It was an expression of satisfaction, as if the figure had been waiting for years, for centuries, to see her standing there, helpless, trembling, before it. "I've been waiting, Sarah. Waiting for you to come back. It's time to complete the ritual. Time to release the others." The voice was low, almost hypnotic, as though it was calling her, drawing her in. And yet, it filled her with an intense, gut-wrenching dread. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her body felt as though it was being consumed by the darkness itself. The air in the room had thickened, and she could feel it pressing in on her chest, pushing her down. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground, her hands scraping across the cold wood as she fought to stay conscious. "What do you want from me?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely above a whisper. Her throat felt like it was closing up, like the very words were being swallowed by the darkness. The figure took another step forward. It was so close now. She could feel the weight of its presence, like a stone on her chest, its coldness radiating outward, seeping into her bones. She could smell it too, the stench of death, of rot, of something long forgotten. "It's not what I want, Sarah. It's what you must do. You have no choice. We have all been waiting for you to finish what was started. The ritual, the blood, the sacrifice." Her vision blurred, and she could hear the whispers again, louder this time, a chorus of voices surrounding her, low, guttural voices that seemed to be coming from every direction, coming from the walls, from the floor beneath her, from the very air she breathed. They spoke in unison, their words indistinguishable but full of that same terrible hunger. "Finish it! Finish it!" The figure reached out its long, bony hand, and Sarah could feel the temperature in the room drop even further. She could see the frost spreading over the wood, creeping up the walls like a living thing. "No, please." Her voice was barely audible, the words choking in her throat. "I don't know what you mean." But the figure didn't answer. It merely smiled, a smile that seemed to stretch impossibly wide, splitting its face in two, exposing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth that gleamed in the dim light. And then, as if in slow motion, it reached down, its fingers wrapping around her wrist with a grip so cold, so unyielding, that she could feel the very marrow of her bones freeze. "There is no escape, Sarah, only what is written, only what is already done." With one final, forceful tug, it pulled her forward, and the darkness swallowed her whole. Chapter 10. The Reckoning of Souls. The house had grown silent, but only in the way that a tomb would, oppressively still, yet filled with the quiet whisper of things long dead. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she staggered through the hallways, the shadows clinging to her like thick fog. The cold had seeped into her skin, gnawing at her flesh, and the once inviting warmth of the house now felt like the embrace of a predator, waiting patiently, silently, for its next meal. Her heart was heavy with the weight of what had happened. The ritual, the voices, the figure that had nearly consumed her. She was no longer sure what was real or what had been conjured by the house's sinister forces. Every corner she turned seemed to stretch and twist impossibly, as though the house itself had become a labyrinth designed to trap her forever. The floor beneath her feet creaked, as if the house was alive, breathing in tandem with her panic. She pressed her hand against the cold wall, trying to steady herself, but the stones were slick with something. Sweat, blood. She dared not look too closely. It's not real, she told herself. None of it is real, but the whispers in her mind mocked her thoughts. The voice that had first whispered her name, coaxing her down into the depths of madness, was back, louder now, demanding, insistent. You can't escape, Sarah. You've already given yourself away. You're one of us now. Her pulse quickened. She shook her head violently, as if that would dispel the voice, but it only grew louder, more insistent. We are the forgotten ones, the ones left to rot in the shadows, and you are the key, the last piece. Finish what was started. Release us. It was the same voice that had spoken to her before, the one she thought she had silenced. But the house was full of these voices, these restless, tormented souls who had once lived, breathed and loved, and had been trapped here, forgotten by time, forgotten by everyone but the house. She was their salvation and their vengeance. The ritual had bound her to them, whether she understood it or not. She reached the main hallway, her eyes scanning the walls, which seemed to pulse in time with the beating of her heart. Faint shadows flitted past the edges of her vision. She couldn't tell if they were real, if they were the ghosts of the house's past, or if they were figments of her increasingly frayed sanity. Her fingers tightened around the lantern, the only source of light in this suffocating darkness, its flame flickering as though it, too, was uncertain of her presence in the house. The house. The walls seemed to whisper its name like a prayer, a curse, as though it had been alive longer than she could fathom. The house had always been here. She could feel it now. Its sentience, its will. It was waiting for her. It had been waiting for her to come back. But where could she go? Every exit was sealed. She had tried them all. The front door, the windows, the crawl spaces. She had even tried to dig her way out, only to find the earth was just as cold and unforgiving as the house itself. The house had claimed her long ago, and now it was time to pay the price. As she stepped forward, the ground beneath her trembled. She stumbled back, hands raised, but the trembling did not cease. The floorboards groaned under a weight that was impossible to see. Her breath caught in her throat as something huge shifted in the bowels of the house. The vibrations were sharp, like a low growl reverberating through her bones. Suddenly, the walls cracked. Deep, jagged fissures split the stone, spilling out a thick, inky blackness, darker than night itself. It spread like oil over the floor, crawling toward her, seeking her, wrapping around her feet. No. Sarah tried to pull back, but the floor was no longer the sturdy wood it had once been. It had become something else, something alive, a part of the house itself. The shadows thickened, spreading with impossible speed, swallowing the light from her lantern, until only the suffocating blackness remained. Her breath was shallow, her pulse hammering in her chest. She could hear the footsteps now, slow, deliberate, and heavy. Footsteps that echoed through the void. And then, through the endless black, a face appeared. A gaunt, hollow face, its eyes wide with madness, its mouth stretched in an impossible grin. Its skin was pulled tight against the skull, as though the face had been peeled from the very bones. It was a face she had seen before, the figure that had spoken to her, the one who had whispered her name. The figure stepped forward, its form emerging from the darkness like an omen. As it drew closer, Sarah could see the grotesque details, skin hanging in strips, eyes sunken deep into their sockets, an expression twisted in eternal hunger. And then, its mouth opened, but it wasn't the voice from before that came out. No, this voice was different. It was a chorus, a multitude of voices layered over one another, their tones distorted and overlapping, a cacophony of desperation and rage. The voices filled her ears, their words incomprehensible, but their intent clear. "Release us, Sarah. Set us free!" The air was thick with their presence, the oppressive weight of the voices pressing down on her, filling her lungs, suffocating her. "No!" she gasped, falling to her knees. I can't do this!" The figure reached out, its hand cold and clammy, fingers stretching toward her, its grip tighter than anything she had ever known. She could feel its touch now, as it closed its hand around her throat, lifting her off the ground. "You already have," the figure whispered. "You already did." Her vision swam, the darkness closing in. Her hands clawed at the figure's grip, but it was no use. The air was thick with the scent of death, of decay, of centuries of suffering. The shadows reached up from the floor, from every crack in the walls, and began to close in on her, surrounding her, until she could see nothing but blackness. "Welcome back," the voices whispered, their words falling like shards of glass against her skin. And then the house breathed.